Our next speaker is Silvia Pavoni, who will be joining us digitally from London. She is the founder and editor of Sustainable Views, a new title by the Financial Times Group that focuses on ESG policy and regulation. Since joining the Financial Times Group in 2005, Silvia has been on assignment to over 24 countries, reporting with both written and film pieces for The Banker, for which she was recently the economics editor. She regularly interviews policymakers and business leaders at the highest level. Silvia also serves as an advisory board member of the European Risk Management Council and for the Women in the Future program, and is part of the London-based not-for-profit Women in Leadership in Latin America. Hello, Silvia. How are you this morning?
Hello, really well, thank you. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Audio. Let's talk a little bit about the main challenges, since this session is about sustainable finance and ESG trends. Let's talk about the challenges around ESG reporting that you and other people are encountering as you travel the world and speak to investors, financial advisors, other people in the world of media about the challenges of ESG reporting these days.
Sure. Thank you so much, and thank you again for having me. So, of course, as you have said, our focus here at Sustainable Views is on policy and regulation, but of course, we are talking just after a few days where finance for those solutions that I know you're keen to look into in terms of climate and other sustainability related ventures. That kind of financing kind of was questioned, wasn't it, because of the troubles suffered by the Silicon Valley Bank that then became a bit of a crisis, which required intervention by the US regulator, and ended up coming all the way this side of the world in London, where SVB's UK unit had to be rescued through an emergency deal and ended up being bought by HSBC for £1. So perhaps not particularly good news when it comes to financing those tech companies looking at addressing climate change. Nonetheless, of course, the opportunity is huge because the problem, of course, is huge. And what everyone from investors all the way to policymakers and regulators are trying to do is understanding which of these activities and assets are actually worth investing in and worth allowing circulating among whether it's financial markets or consumer markets, and which ones actually should be stopped or questioned over concerns about greenwashing. So greenwashing is arguably top of mind for pretty much all regulators around the world. And you're seeing what is coming out of Europe. And of course, Europe, as you know, is a jurisdiction that is more ready, let's say, to sort of dictate rules rather than allowing rules to seep through from the markets upwards. And so we have a lot of discussions about taxonomy, whether certain assets should be included, having repercussions, of course, on the companies holding and dealing with these assets. But we also have international, as you know, activity around how to define those assets and how to disclose and report to investors the nature of companies' activities when it comes to sustainability. So, of course, we have the International Sustainability Standards Board that is looking at international standards in this area, but we also have the SEC in the US looking at mandating potentially disclosures when it comes to carbon emissions, but this potentially could also expand into other areas. So this is all to say it's a really exciting moment for anyone looking at this problem, which is climate change, which is well accepted as being a problem. There is a lot of ingenuity going around in the corporate world, a lot of entrepreneurs also coming up with the solutions, but there are also huge concerns when it comes to greenwashing and what should be allowed to be defined as a green venture and what shouldn't.
You know, Silvia, we're starting to roll out major regulatory infrastructures and frameworks across the major markets in the world today. The SEC in the U.S., the European taxonomy in the EU, in the UK, the FCA is promulgating its own set of regulations. How are all of these frameworks, from your perspective right now, looking in terms of eventual convergence into a global framework? Because ultimately, as a consultant to investors and financial advisors, one of the questions that I get all the time is, when are we going to have a framework that everyone can comply with and use so that we can do the appropriate reporting and we're not having to do it 3 different times or 4 different times with different frameworks around the world? What's your perspective on that?
Yes, of course. I mean, reporting fatigue is a real thing. And of course, we know this by talking to companies, but also regulators are very much aware of this. The problem, unfortunately, is that because different jurisdictions have a different point of view on how to tackle this, the task at hand is quite big. And of course, you know that in Europe, the European Union is looking at asking companies that will have to disclose their sustainability activities under a specific set of rules, that they do so looking at both the implications on the company of environmental and social aspects, but also on the company's impact on the planet and on people. So the so-called double materiality approach, which you know well, while other parts of efforts elsewhere, including at the international level with the ISSB, point to the financial materiality only, which is what investors arguably may be more interested in, or that perhaps could be easier to a certain degree to report on. Now, on the point of whether we're going to have just one framework, perhaps unlikely, but we are definitely seeing a certain level of convergence. In fact, we have seen SASB flowing into the ISSB, and also the ISSB referencing to the EU's reporting rules when the very own rules of the ISSB would be lacking. So there is certainly an effort to coming together and create just one, or rather a sort of a reporting that is comparable across the world, but I doubt we're going to have just one framework. But it seems like the efforts are going to, by companies disclosing those that kind of information, is going to be eased off ever so gently.
You know, there's 2 different broad perspectives related to this type of convergence over time, and they are, one of them suggests that it will be the regulatory infrastructures that will dominate this type of convergence, and the other one suggests, like we're seeing with disruption in various markets recently in the last 6 months or so, how the markets will drive that process. Please share your perspective on that in terms of the convergence of these 2 main drivers for regulatory infrastructure and market-based solutions.
So there seems to be quite a big effort by regulators to try and gain feedback from the markets, and we report on this constantly. And if anything, actually, we have a lot of companies, financial and otherwise companies, actually saying that there is too much feedback to be given, and so they'll kind of snow down all these endless requests for feedback to the regulator. So it feels like it's a process that's being driven by both investors and the private sector markets and by regulators, but it is definitely, I would argue, correct to say that the second the regulator jumps on this, that's when everyone really pays attention, because it becomes a compliance issue. And of course, few people would want this really to become only a compliance issue, because you do want ultimately to have these companies really moving in the direction they say they're moving, rather than just ending up having a sort of a tick box exercise. On the other hand, you also now have a number of people saying that actually the regulators are being a little bit too strict in their requirements, and this is in turn leading towards a perhaps short-sighted compliance effort, rather than allowing companies and investors as well to pour capital where they see the ultimate goal being of what these companies do, rather than actually ticking the correct boxes along the way. But it feels at the moment that because of regulators really paying attention and greater attention and focusing on this area, that this is what is driving this area forward.
Okay, so now that we have the opportunity here to speak with one of the most traveled worldwide journalists and most experienced journalists in this field, what questions do you have? Now's the opportunity. This is someone with an international publication who works in this field on a day-to-day basis and has been stationed in many countries around the world. What questions do you have in the audience for Silvia? Oh, come on. People are being shy. Speak up, please. Get engaged in the conversation. That's what you're here for today, right? Okay. Please give us your name, your company.
Sure. Morning, everybody. My name is Eric Planey. I'm with a small startup called SoloBlock. Obviously, in Europe, there's a lot of concern about the ramifications of the IRA Act in Europe, allowing a lot of green supply chain to migrate from both Europe and Asia to North America. Does that create any other issues with regards to, harmony in talking about ESG reporting and some of the other things that probably we need a little more consistency with, over the Atlantic and internationally?
It's a really interesting.
Go ahead, Silvia.
It's a really interesting question, actually, because I don't think we've seen a direct correlation, or a direct link, rather, between the European reaction to the Inflation Reduction Act and its green subsidies and reporting. But certainly, you are absolutely correct in saying that there are quite strong tensions and trying to ensure that Europe is competitive when it comes to having those green tech companies actually staying or investing in the block. So maybe it's a good point. Maybe we could see some of these arguments actually influencing perhaps reporting rules. Although I have to say, it's good to talk about it because intellectually it is interesting. I'm not quite sure whether that will actually lead to let's say, more flexible rules in the end.
Okay, who else had a question? Come on, don't be shy. I've got one for you, Silvia. How about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions reporting? Where is that perspective these days in your work and your travels? How is that unfolding across different jurisdictions and regulatory infrastructures?
Yeah, sure. So, well, scope 3 is the biggie, isn't it? So it's difficult, obviously, to present an accurate picture. Everyone is using estimates. It's good news for the data providers and the rating agencies because they're ready, and I know this for a fact, they're very much ready to provide estimates about small companies to help the bigger companies at the head of supply chains to disclose that kind of information. But this is where we are. So it's still very difficult because you can imagine it's relatively difficult for a big company. It's almost impossible because of the various reasons to do with the time and resources that they can dedicate to track and monitor this information, and the urgency that is placed on them for smaller companies. And of course, supply chains, international supply chains are made of very small, medium to very small size companies. So everyone is working at it. But again, in the short term, the ones that are going to benefit the most are the data providers.
Yes. Hello? Oh, yeah. Yes, that's a perspective that I think is has come along with part of the regulatory rollout by at least the SEC here in the US, is that major companies are an integral part of the federal government's procurement system to the tune of about $600 billion a year. And what's happening now is that those large corporations are going to be required to report at least Scope 1 and Scope 2 carbon emissions in order to secure their contracts with the federal government going forward. So there's got to be a question in the room from somebody about how that's going to play out across supply chains. Who wants to ask that? Go ahead, or something related to that. Thank you.
I'll ask a question about accounting. On Scope 1 and Scope 2, or even Scope 3 actually, and the discussion around biogenics and how they're going to be reported within those scopes. So we have a lot of funding going into renewable fuels and renewable energy, and there's GHG protocols having a lot of discussion around whether those biogenics will be permitted to count as reductions. And I think that would stump corporate funding. So wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. Another interesting question. I don't think that's being raised in the conversations I've been having, but it would definitely be interesting in looking into that specific field. So I have to say again, it's not a technical aspect that I've personally looked into. But thanks for raising. I wonder if anyone else in the room actually has a view on this.
Any other views on that from other people in the room? All of our energy and carbon reporting experts. Okay. Silvia, I have another question, and that is, now that we're in this phase of the rollout of the regulatory infrastructures in the major economies, how does someone who's reporting on those kinds of issues integrate that process with what they're doing for their media channels? One of the things that I find is that financial advisors, investors, asset managers are all still trying to get their arms around this. And so when you've got very large corporations working on these issues, how are they handling the internal process within their own companies for getting to the bottom of what they should actually report and how they should do it?
So you're not asking me about the Financial Times, are you? You're asking me about companies in general?
This is not about the Financial Times specifically, no.
So, I mean, different companies obviously go at it in very different ways. Some appear to be more serious about actually changing their business strategies. Some others perhaps are a little bit more cynical. Which again has prompted quite a lot of policy action and scrutiny because of all these accusations around greenwashing. So we go back to that issue. So the best way to avoid the regulator being on your case is to be careful about what you say, which had unintended consequences perhaps of leading some of these companies to come up about any of these sometimes also very useful activities, but also not to overstate what you're doing and being careful. There being a number of scandals from the textile industry to other industry, consumer-facing industries, tend to be the ones that suffer the most, that are more exposed to these kind of events. What I find, speaking to the people that we speak to, is that if the head of the company, if the CEO has a strong conviction about the importance of dealing with all this kind of stuff, then the company follows. And speaking to a number of advisors, you were saying, Peter, you also speak to advisors that they also struggle because there is a group within every company that perhaps we can call the evangelicals, and no need to convince them. They actually perhaps also come from outside of the corporate world, and they're being brought in to try and change things. So speaking to them is absolutely fine, but then speaking to the decision makers, to the C-suite, sometimes is the hard part. And just the other day I was speaking to one of those consultants, and they were saying it's a real struggle because the language of sustainability is not clear. When there is an energy crisis and interest rates are spiking, and there are all these other difficult things to deal with in the economy, then sustainability is still, the wider concept of sustainability takes sometimes the back seat, even if, of course, it is a very serious and urgent threat. So I guess the answer is that it very much depends on the company, and it very much depends on the person in charge of that company.
Thank you very much, Silvia. And we've got a couple minutes left in the session here. So were there any closing remarks that you think would be helpful to our audience today to take home or take back to work with them to discuss with their colleagues and integrate into their business based on your work?
Sure. Well, you know, again, we monitor what policymakers are doing, what regulators are doing, and that activity will only continue to accelerate. And that's the trend that we're seeing all over the world, not just in Europe. So that's certainly something to bear in mind. And the scrutiny over what is being said, of the kind of labels we put on investments, on activities, also will only increase. And with COP28, of course, talking about controversy, we have COP28 and the UN discussions that the climate talks being led by the chief executive of an oil company, and that created a lot of criticism by certain corners of this debate, while some others were saying, well, maybe that's a good thing because we really truly include everyone in the conversation. And so what I think is important to bear in mind for everyone, us included in the media, is to use the right terminology and to get to the right language to discuss the subject that's at hand, which is arguably the defining issue of our time.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much, Silvia Pavoni, the founder and editor of Sustainable Views, which is a part of the Financial Times group that focuses on ESG policy and regulation. And we are glad that you were able to join us today from London. Silvia, thank you very much for your participation in the 2023 Wall Street Green Summit.
My pleasure. Thank you.